Welcome to Risk Takers and Trailblazers, where we dive into stories of resilience, growth, and navigating the tough landscape of today's professional world. Today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Laura Hambley Lovett with us. Dr. Laura is a work and career psychologist, thought leader, and a host of her very own podcast, Where Work Meets Life, which is an amazing podcast, which we'll get to through this conversation for sure. With her upcoming book, Toxic Bosses, she sheds light on one of the biggest challenges many professionals face, navigating toxic leadership.
Wow.
Join us as Dr. Laura shares her expert insights into recognizing toxic behaviors, understanding the impact, and reclaiming our very own well-being in the workplace. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Laura last year at IBAA. We just touched on that we may have fangirled her at the stage because we were completely blown away by her talk. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I think that this podcast, Risk Takers and Trailblazers, is amazing. And I'm so excited to have my special mug here today, which is a great gift from your team. Cheers to that.
Cheers to that, for sure. So, Dr. Laura, let's start just talking quickly in a small condensed bit of your background and what really led you to specialize in the well-being and psychology side of the workplace.
Oh my goodness. So my psychology career, began in the late 90s. I did a master's degree in psychology, and I was really drawn to career psychology because A, it's a niche area that not many psychologists specialize in, and B, career is a huge part of our happiness or unhappiness in life. And for better or worse, it's a part of our identity. It's the second question we ask. What's your name? What do you do? And when it is part of our identity, it really can make or break our joy and fulfillment. So that's why I specialize in career. And workplaces can be horrible and can be great and everything in between. And I'm on a mission to make more healthy workplaces where human beings can thrive.
Love that. It's true. Very, very true.
So, Dr. Laura, I have to admit, since we were bringing you on as a guest, I was deep diving into your podcast and I can't stop listening to it because the content is so relevant, from having an expert researcher on the 4-day work week, or the different types of toxic bosses traits, or neurodiversity in the workplace. I think all of it is so relevant right now, and the information is all research backed, which I love, because you hear anecdotal information, but I can go back and be like, well, actually, I was listening to this podcast, and you can cite the research. And I am fangirling. I told the ladies on the podcast, like, I need to write her summary because I just love her so much.
And this is true. She did.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you
And
so
even my
much.
husband's been listening on the podcast. He's like, this is
Oh.
really good. I can use this for my own teaching. And I was like, yes. So what inspired you to start the podcast in the first place?
Well, I always wanted a podcast. We had a radio show called Career Cravings that my business partner in Toronto was leading, and I got pulled into that radio show a few times to interview guests, and I really loved that. That was probably about 8 years ago. And then I said, I really want a podcast. Maybe we can take turns hosting it on our team at Canada Career Counseling. And the team said, no, we don't want to take that on. And I said, well, for my 45th birthday, damn it, I'm going to start a podcast. And it was 2020 and the pandemic was in full swing. And I said, I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to do it. And it's going to be my name. And there's a Dr. Laura in the US who's a bully on the radio there. And she's in her 70s. And I'm not going to be that Dr. Laura. I'm going to be a Dr. Laura that is evidence-based and empathetic and brings topics to the forefront at the intersection of work and life. So helping us thrive as humans, helping organizations thrive, and helping people find career fulfillment. And then with a side helping of how we can advocate for a better world. So it has a lot of variety on it, but that's what I like about it, because each and every topic is something I'm genuinely interested in. And it's a labor of love. And now I'm in year 5 of that.
I love that. There was one quick thing I think we didn't mention in her intro, and I think it's important, is Dr. Laura is Canadian based. She's actually Alberta based and here in Calgary as well, which I think is also well worthy of mentioning for sure.
Well, and
Yes,
one thing that
native Calgarian. I
There you
love
go.
Calgary.
Awesome.
I think you can tell when you listen to your podcast, like you just said, you're passionate about
Yes.
what you're speaking about. You can really tell when you listen to it. I just listened to the one about the difference between a toxic boss and a
Mhm.
difficult boss, and I think that that was, it was very interesting to hear the differences. But your new book that's coming out is all focusing on toxic bosses. So, how would you define a toxic boss, or I guess toxic leadership in general?
Oh, wow. So a toxic boss. So I use the word boss because I don't believe they should be called a leader. I believe a leader is someone who turns around and people are following and they're gracious about that. They're humble about that. They want to truly inspire and grow and develop people, where a boss is a boss because they happen to have that power position and the ability to control someone's work. But toxic bosses are bosses that cause harm to people's mental and physical health. So there's different ways that they do that, but they have an intent to harm almost, or they they're not doing it just because, it's an accident, or, they're inadvertently causing harm. They are harmful and they cannot be changed through coaching, etc. They would need deep, deep therapy or a major life event to change and alter that. So that's what a toxic boss is. They exert harm on a daily and regular basis to their people, be it psychological harm, and it turns into physical harm. It harms confidence. So they have toxic behaviors, and they do so through a number of different personas that they take on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh,
So that's different than, so you kind of, one of the things you said in there was talking about how, it's not a mistake, it's not unintentional, it's not like, maybe we talk about that for a second. Like, I'm assuming there's these leaders too that, or bosses, or maybe they're in the classification of leaders, where they're learning how to lead, and in those cases potentially they're making mistakes and what have you. So you're saying there's a distinct line between somebody who's a toxic boss that's wanting to cause harm, or versus a leader who is learning how to lead, potentially making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, trying to get better, that type of thing.
Totally, totally. And I've worked with leaders for 25 years now in organizational psychology, and I'd say that every leader makes mistakes and fumbles. And I think there are a lot of difficult leaders out there because maybe they were really good as an insurance agent or a lawyer or an engineer, and they've been promoted to people leadership because they're good at their job, but they have not been properly trained in people leadership, or they just don't have the proper DNA for people leadership. And that's why I'm in business. That's why my team's in business, because there's a lot of struggles because of that. There's a lot of difficult leaders, and they don't want to be difficult, but it's just, it's personality, it's skills, it's strengths all at play in trying to lead human beings, which is one of the most difficult jobs, but it's thought to be easy, but it's difficult.
I think you've just touched on something as a leader, and gone through the ranks and watching new leaders, through mentorship and people that coming up through the ranks. One of the things you just mentioned was around, new leaders coming in and been good at their job, but now they're been promoted to a different position. And what are some of the things that maybe we don't do right? And I'll tell you, we don't do it right. We just promote somebody. But what are some of the tools that we, like in a toolkit, we can help to avoid some of this difficult leaders turning into toxic, or helping, stopping the toxicity from the beginning, especially to new leaders? Because I think that's truly where we need to start.
Well, stopping it from the beginning means being very, very careful with hiring and promotion practices.
Okay.
And digging deeper beyond an interview. So we have wonderful psychometrics and stuff that can help get at a person's attributes and behaviors and predict behavior in the workplace. And those might not get rid of 100% of toxic leaders, but they certainly limit the error, the hiring errors. And then it's promotion errors, right? So promoting based on friendship or popularity or being part of the old boys club or whatever, versus being promoted on, are you an effective leader? So if you're being promoted from one level to the next level of leadership, have the people that reported to you found great, results and development and support from you? That's rarely part of the decision.
Right. Great points.
Are there certain trait commonalities with toxic leaders, and how does that affect the team and the organization in general?
Are there certain traits? Yes. And I would say that's a really good question, Tanya. So there's overt and covert, and that's part of my definition. So it's ongoing overt or covert behaviors that harm employees' engagement, productivity, and well-being. So overt means the outward, like the being an a-hole, right? Like abusive talk, condescending, losing your temper, those sorts of things that we think of, with the bully, the harasser, and those are part of it, but not everyone is like that. We got the snakes in the grass too that are more covert in their behaviors. So they're very manipulative, very deceitful, very dishonest, and they do so very carefully and under the surface, and it bites you, and it's horrible. It's almost worse than the overt ones, because at least the overt, what's happening, but that emotional, psychological abuse, the gaslighting that can happen in a more covert manner is very, very damaging to people. And it leads to turnover, it leads to stress, medical leaves, a fear-based culture, and ultimately it decreases the performance of the company over time. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, it decreases the profits and performance.
The covert sounds a lot like narcissistic personality traits. I don't know if there's like a correlation there, but that gaslighting, the manipulation,
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's actually one of my 8 personas is the disordered personality. And the ones that I talk most about are narcissism and sociopathy. So the sociopathic boss and the narcissistic boss, definitely. And gaslighting, I've put into a category of its own, the gaslighter. So yeah, there's 8 different personas, and it's my way of describing the different behaviors. And most toxic bosses have multiple personas going on. But if you can recognize that in your toxic boss, you have a better chance of getting out sooner than sticking around and having your confidence damaged and your physical health damaged.
Yeah. So for those people that are listening now or listening down the future, and they've listened to our podcast, they've found you on your podcast, and they've done some fangirling of their own, or fanboying, or just overall general.
Oh my God, don't build my ego. I'm trying to keep my ego down.
And they're listening, and they can identify themselves with, some of these, or be it not now, but maybe even in the past. So I kind of want to take this in 2 avenues. Sorry guys, but this is where I want to take it is,
love it.
Because listening to it, because I've as well listened to your podcast,
thank
and the most recent one about the toxic bosses, and was thinking about older bosses I had, right? So let's deal with that trauma for a second. How do you help someone who, while listening now, can realize that that's what they had? And are there things that we can help them to go, okay, your next boss won't be like that, and here's some things to help navigate that. And then the second part to that is, if you're in a situation now when you identify through this that you have a toxic boss, what can you do to protect yourselves?
Yeah, so those are a lot of questions. I think they're really, really good questions. And I think I'm writing this book, which will come out by the end of 2025 or early 26. The publishing timelines are really long. I like to get things out fast, but when you're in the publishing world, there's lots of steps. But I wrote it because I really wanted to help people identify when they're in a situation with a toxic boss that they're not alone, how to navigate it, and that they do have lots of choices in front of them, because often people stay because they feel stuck.
Hex.
And yeah, and also if they're a high achiever, they have a lot of grit and resilience to push through, and I can make it work. I can do this. I can stick it out. Maybe things
Yep.
will get better. And then before you know it, your confidence is eroded and your energy is so low, you don't have energy to look for another job. And we know that takes a lot of energy. And lots of people are financially caught up in the company. Maybe they have a bonus coming up in 8 months, or they have pension or stocks, and they get trapped financially. So I really help people through the book and through my speaking and podcasting understand that there are choices and there are other career options that you can make up that money financially. But I think your mental and physical health does not have a price tag. You know what I mean?
Yep. I agree with that for sure.
So
And I
that's
think it'd be interesting for you. I know you're getting into more of Helen's questions as well, but something in that sequence there, like I always come back to the fallout. Like not even just the person's fallout, right? Because obviously that's the most important thing. But I'm talking about like productivity and the fallout in general. So when we talk about leading from fear, I guess, versus leading from, I don't even know if I want to use this word, but leading from love, it's like those are the fallout of that is serious. And
Mhm.
like if you're growing a company or you're leading a company or a CEO, and I think there's not enough people talking about this, and you'll hear me on our podcast really always bringing it back to the scalability of a community or the scalability of positive leadership and what that actually does for the bottom line. And to me, those things are super exciting. So I think there's so much that's not even being talked about in terms of, if you led this way, what could that actually do for your team and your people and your sales and your pipeline and the list goes on and on and on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it is not talked about enough. And there's a lot of talk about great leadership and what makes great leaders, but there's not enough talk about the dark side of leadership and the
Yes.
damage that does corporately. So I'm really happy that I can be shedding a light on this.
Awesome. That's amazing.
And I'm
What
doing research projects on it. I'm on my third research project. I have two going on right now. And one is toxic leadership and burnout across the generations, and how the younger generations handle toxic bosses and how it impacts their burnout compared to the older generations and my generation, Generation X. And that'll be interesting. And then measuring it, like how do we assess for toxic leadership? That's what I'm really excited about. And there's not much research in North America. Most of the research on toxic leadership is overseas. It's other than the US military and like a bit here and there. It's an understudied area.
Wow.
Do you think it's a cultural thing? Like, do you think because we live in such a productive Western, like, it's like you just do what you're told, head down, work, like, don't complain. And I think it's when really Generation Z, as they were moving into the workforce, were like, no, no. And that idea
Yeah,
of quitting,
no.
right? They're like, I'm not putting, like, there were things I put up with that I think even my niece, who's, a Gen Zer, she's like, why? And I was like,
Yeah, why would you put up with that? That's
you're
BS.
toxic.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
don't stay.
So,
I talk
yeah.
to a law firm, like I'm speaking to the legal community sometimes these days, and they have a lot of younger generations saying, I call BS on this. Like, I'm not going to stay. And then they're saying, why are we losing our young lawyers? And then there's a high percentage of toxic workplaces out there in law. I'm like, okay, you guys got to fix this, or you're not going to have young lawyers wanting to A, work for you, or B, go into the field of law.
Yeah.
And both are problematic issues.
Dr. I hear that so much from my lawyer friends across the board, how toxic, because you don't hear about it unless you have a friend in it. And it's eye-opening. It's eye-opening.
Brutal. And not just law, healthcare is bad too for toxic
Yes.
leaders. And that makes me so sad because it's the antithesis of health, right?
Yeah.
Higher education, post-secondaries, bad for toxic leaders. And that's terrible too.
Interesting. But I do like that connectivity that you just made with it, Tan, about the generational side of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
But that also maybe could
Every
come.
generation kind of teaches and informs the older,
Yeah.
because when they first come in, you're like, you don't know anything, stop. And then you're like, wait a second, like the millennial, like the Gen Xers did it to boomers, millennials did it to Gen X when they totally kind of redid the idea of the 9 to 5 with the contract work and things like that. And then now Gen Zers are like, there's more to life than work stress. There's more to this than work stress. And
exactly. They're evolving workplace cultures, and there's a lot of pushback on it.
Yeah.
And I think that we need talking about generations, and I never like to pick a generation because there's lots of diversity within each generation, right? But I think it's important to understand how I'm wired and what my values are and how you're wired and how we grew up differently and how we can better understand each other. And that's what generational dynamics are all about, understanding and appreciating differences.
Well, and I think if you're promoting leaders, like what you just said is so key, because if you're promoting leaders and you're trying like too early, or it's all for the wrong, like what you just said is like, I think about that and think, wow, that's a big job. That's a big job to learn everybody, their personalities, how I can support them, how I can motivate them, how I can help them achieve their goals. So if I'm willy-nilly promoting leaders or hiring somebody into my team that is just a band-aid, or it's not well thought through, I'm thinking, I'm not even setting up that leader for success. You know what I mean? It's one thing to sit there and say, hey, go do this because I'm telling you to do this. It's quite another thing to be bringing in leaders that have the ability to lead today in today's world with these generations. And I think that's a whole hefty topic.
Yeah, that's a whole other wormhole.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, crazy.
So if someone say you're listening and you've identified someone in your organization after listening to this podcast and maybe listening to some of your episodes on toxic bosses, who's certainly a toxic boss. What is some advice you can give? Because there's that fear of coming forward, and so what advice would you give when someone's like, oh, this explains a lot. This explains my low self-esteem, my fatigue, why I've developed perfectionist skill, like whatever the traits are that you might have developed over time working under a toxic leader. Like, do you advise just to leave the workplace in general, or do you or is it dependent on speaking up, or what can we tell people?
Well, I mean, it depends. I think putting into place coping strategies and including taking care of your mental health, getting the right supports, being able to have some trusted people you can talk to about it, putting into place boundaries, which don't always work very well with a toxic boss, by the way. But I always say it's about crafting an exit plan. It's about crafting an exit plan for how you are going to get out of there. And in my book, I talk about exit plan and help with the different steps of that. And at Canada Career Counseling, we do that too, which is what inspired me to write the book, was the number of clients across the country from all different industries that come to us and they're struggling with this and they're trying to get out. And then we help be a sounding board and can help with the emotional side, but also the what are we going to do about it? What do you need to do? What steps do you need to put in place? So a really solid exit plan, because not many people can just quit tomorrow. And then there's the discussion we've had with lots of clients. Should you take a medical leave, right? What are the pros and cons of doing that? And a lot of people are, no, I can't do that. It'll ruin my career. But if your mental health is on the brink, you may not have a choice. And it actually may be an incredible healing opportunity. And then there's filing a claim, or filing a complaint with HR, that's a big decision. And depending on HR's authority and HR's influence in the organization, that could work for or against you. And I love HR. I think HR is in a difficult position, though, with this whole topic, especially if the toxic leadership is at the top, then it's almost impossible. And I've seen it time and time again where HR is caught in the middle and they're trying to do the right thing, but the politics just overpower everything, and it's heartbreaking. You can file an HR a complaint through HR. You could get into legal. You could file a legal claim, but that's a whole discussion with an employment lawyer. But I talk about all of this stuff because there's lots of choices, but the choices have to make sense for the human being and their unique situation.
Yeah, I think your one comment about HR is very spot on and relative today. I think the HRs of many years back, their primary roles and their functions versus today's role and what they're handling and what they're equipped to handle. I'm not sure even their studies and their no disrespect to them, but even their courses that they're taking truly have them set up for success to help those individuals coming to them now for different things, for the different mental stresses that they could have inside, outside of work, the boss situations that we're talking about. So I think HR is also in a very, very different place today versus years ago.
I think so too. It's increasingly complex.
Yeah.
VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That would be the way to describe today's workplaces, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for sure. It's almost like you need two different types of HRs. One to really deal with the people management side of things, like the wellness piece, and then the other side of the HR to deal with the more organizational structural pieces, the day-to-day pay, benefits, those type of things. Like I think there is now, as we're evolving as a workplace, as people, different generations, right? We've touched on that. I think HR needs to also evolve to match that as well, to really help.
100%. 100%. But it has to be in the right corporate,
Correct.
culture. If you have an executive team or a CEO who's old school, command and control, people are assets, resources. Get them all back into the office 100%, and that's it. I need to see them. And just it's just working against the whole evolution of work being human-centric.
Right? For sure.
Who did we meet with from CAA and the way they are treating HR now? Remember we had
Joanna Mara,
yes,
friend of mine.
I love the way that there's like you see some organizations that are really taking that approach and having those different people in place to cover the different aspects and not just HR.
Yeah, they have like their chief people officers as well as HR directors, right? So there are some companies that are starting that venture and that journey. Based on the workforce that they have.
Yeah,
right?
Shout out to CAA. They're one of the best companies I think we have in Canada. But I do think I wanted to ask you, is there any correlation or is there any differences, between these bigger companies, institutional type environments versus smaller companies? Do you see any kind of it being worse in some of those environments? Like I think of, and one thing you touched on, financial, right? I think of, maybe some people that are with institutional environments and there's a pension and there's a lot of other ties other than just your daily salary. Does that play, do you see more of this issue in these bigger companies versus small companies, or it's just all over the place?
Well, no, that's not necessarily true. I'll use the analogy of families, right? So you can have a family with 2 people that has a toxic relationship,
Right.
or you can have a big extended Italian family with 100 cousins and everything, and it can be completely toxic as well. It just depends. It's not about size. It's about whether you have fear-based people that have unresolved trauma. It's all about unresolved trauma, which is why Heal to Lead is on my shelf. And she's an upcoming podcast episode, Kelly Campbell. And it's all about leaders are toxic and difficult because they haven't healed their traumas from their own past.
I'm gonna
And
go
it's
find that book. I'm just saying, I just wrote it down.
Yeah.
it'll be a good episode. It's coming up soon, but it really moved me, so that's why I keep the book up there right now. But it doesn't matter about the size. I've seen toxic leadership in the smallest company or in a startup environment. And a startup environment doesn't have I don't like to say controls, but the HR and the formal processes and the things. So toxicity can go awry real quick. But I've also seen it in the biggest institutions, in the government, in
Oh, yeah.
post-secondary, in municipal government, in healthcare, where it's like thousands of people and it's running rampant, even though you have whistleblowing policies and healthy workplace and a code of conduct and all these things. But the stuff's still going on.
Yeah.
So I think it doesn't matter the size.
You offer a toxic boss quiz on your website. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how it might help our listeners to go in and take?
Yeah, so I just wanted a way to get people to start thinking about it. So I have 8 personas, but I have a quiz based on 3 of the common 8, just to give you a taster, and it's super easy to do. It's just, does my boss, so it's about your current boss, or it can be about a past boss if you're curious if they fit these things, because oftentimes it takes a few years to fully recover if you've been in a toxic boss relationship. It's almost like an abusive romantic relationship in some ways. I was going back and forth with a therapist on LinkedIn actually yesterday about this, because there's commonalities between leaving an abuser romantically and leaving an abusive boss. And she said, I've been treating the trauma from abusive bosses. Like it's a thing, it's a big deal. So you get this trauma, and I just want people to recognize that they may have had or currently have a toxic boss. I have 3 types. They answer questions, and it kind of says whether you might be suffering from a self-serving egomaniac or a dishonest manipulator, etc. So there's these different types. It just gets you familiar with the lingo.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Easy. I had a question quick for you. Do you do you get a lot of leaders coming to you in terms of how to improve? Is that is that another area of where you help?
Yeah. So myself and my team, we absolutely love coaching leaders, training them, helping them with assessments like 360s, and we do lots of work to help leaders grow and evolve. Absolutely.
Yeah, amazing. I read once, I don't know why it's escaping me, the Brene Brown, she did a book on leadership.
Dare to lead.
Dare to Lead. That's what it is.
I have that on my shelf for sure.
Love that book. Yeah.
It's great. Yeah,
Great
and there's
book.
so many great books on great leadership again, but I think the toxic piece is underrepresented.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and she talks about in there, that's kind of where I first learned the leading with fear is so the wrong way for so many levels.
Yeah.
If we
It
can
is.
stop
It's
leading
about
with fear.
scarcity,
Yeah.
fear, control, greed, all of the above. And yeah, it goes against what you really need to evolve your organization, your culture, and your people.
Yeah.
So I guess if you could give one key piece of advice from everything we've kind of been talking about today or insight to our listeners, about leadership or workplace well-being or anything we've chatted about, what would that key piece be?
Get your people's input into what's going on. So if you're an organization, you should be collecting information and hearing from people. And that's not just an annual engagement survey. That's identifying hotspots through really targeted climate information, climate surveys, pulse surveys that ask the right questions and then do something about what you hear. So if you hear I call it a hotspot, a toxic hotspot, and that could be a leader where people are given really low ratings or they're leaving. There's a lot of exits, that you're losing talent. That's a hotspot. You better go put out that fire, figure immediately. And oftentimes it festers for like a couple of years even. It's just terrible.
Yeah. That's so important. I think a lot of organizations do the, once a year check in, but then what are they implementing
After.
I
once it
know.
comes in?
It's check. It's a checkbox, but it needs
Yeah.
to be a ongoing mission to be on a hunt for hotspots so you don't have a forced fire.
Well, and I think, I'd love to have you come back because I think, what would be interesting for these leaders that are coming up or leaders that are in place right now, or if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking expanding your team and you're looking at putting more leaders around the table, like what are some of those things that you should be looking for? Because I think if you're growing a business, you're the or a product or whatever, right? You're probably the first thing and I don't even know if this is right or wrong, but the first thing you didn't, I'm assuming the first thing you thought about was we have a product, we have a problem to solve. I want to go do that. That's probably what is coming from an entrepreneurial's brain, right? It's later on, it's like, wow, I've got 20 employees, I've got 30 employees. You know what I mean? I feel like maybe this part we have to tune out and edit 10, but I feel like there's a lot of education, and I don't know if you can teach a leader. I'm sure there's things that you can teach, but I don't know if this is landing, but I feel like if I'm going to start a business tomorrow, and this was 10, 15 years ago, I'm thinking about the product and the problem I'm trying to solve. I don't even know if I have the awareness to think of in 10 years, I might be responsible for 50 people. What does that actually look like? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to come back for a two to be like, what would if I was going to go and hire the next director of operations, or what would I look for, right?
Oh yeah. You need to look at what characteristics, personality attributes, skills, all those things. The skills are the easy part. It's more the personality characteristics that are important, in both the normal and the abnormal ones. So it's really tough though to assess for abnormal, right? Because it's like a whole other thing, narcissism and whatnot. It's tough to assess for, but there are ways to assess for great leadership attributes, and there's ways to minimize the error in hiring.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that's good.
Okay, well, we are at time. Thank you again so much for coming on to our podcast. We are so happy to have you. We're very much looking forward to when your book comes out, Toxic Bosses, in 2025 or early 2026. And maybe we'll have you come on to do some media in and around that book launch. We'd love that. And I do really, really urge anyone listening to go over to Dr. Laura's podcast, where Work Meets Life. It is phenomenal. The content quality is insane. And I'm a researcher at heart, and it's just so evidence-based. And I think that's why I really love listening to it. And it resonates so strongly with what we're facing today. As always, we will link everything below, and please follow, take someone who you think would take a lot of value from this episode. And thank you again, Dr. Laura.
You are so welcome. And drlaura.live is my website where all the episodes are housed, and you can search by topic, and they're all on YouTube as well as all the audio platforms.